Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. We're starting a great 2022 with a terrific lineup of both live stream and in-person programming. I'll provide you all with a brief summary of our upcoming programs at the end of today's program. You can also check them out on our website at lawacth.org. For those of you who would like to ask questions of our speaker and moderator today, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Claire Krelitz, our communications manager and digital producer, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which should start in about 30 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to open the discussion on today's program, The Art of Middle East Diplomacy, with Martin Indyk, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel and author of Master of the Game. His moderator will be Colonel Richard Downie, Ph.D., Managing Director at Delphi Strategic Consulting, and also USA retired USMA 1976. It is my pleasure to turn this over to you, Richard. We have a terrific audience just waiting for this discussion. And also a note that the book, Mr. Indyk's book, will be listed in our chat for all of our audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. It's really an honor and pleasure for me to be able to moderate this, and I welcome all those in our audience. I think you'll find this to be a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed this book. It's Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. I think you will too. Not personally being a Middle East specialist, I found it really interesting, and it's not just because it's about the history of a very important piece of Middle East period in the Middle East, the shuttle diplomacy of Henry Kissinger. But what I now understand is that if you really want to understand the dynamics of what is happening in the Middle East today, it's important to understand the framework that Henry Kissinger put into place during that period and remained for decades and really continues to impact the region now, which is something I look forward to. So it's a pleasure also to be here with Ambassador Indyk, who Kim mentioned that he was the ambassador to Israel, but he wasn't just the ambassador once, he was the ambassador twice, which is an amazing accomplishment for anyone, let alone someone with an Australian accent, as well as being an envoy for the Palestinian negotiations later on. And Ambassador Indyk, before we get started talking about your book, I really wanted to ask you, since you're in many of the same places, talking to the same people that Kissinger talked to during that period, while you were ambassador twice and dealing with the Palestinians, did you feel that you understood or could apply some of the lessons that Kissinger, from your experience watching Kissinger do this and over historically?
Well, thank you, Richard, for agreeing to moderate this session. Thank you, Kim, and the Los Angeles World Affairs Council for hosting us. I'm very grateful to you all. You know, I had actually written my PhD dissertation at the Australian National University in Canberra, a long way from here, after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and after I had watched Kissinger conduct the diplomacy that I write about in the book. And that PhD dissertation was on the role of the United States in settling the Arab-Israeli conflict. So when I came into government, I thought I did know Kissinger. And I was at times quite surprised, even shocked, that the people I was working with, became good friends of mine, did not know Kissinger, in the sense that they did not approach the issues in a strategic way that he did. And in a way, that was why I decided at the end of my time of trying to make peace and having failed repeatedly 3 times, that I decided to go back and study again what Kissinger had done with the documents all available and the archives open both in the United States and Israel. And having access to Kissinger himself, he was very generous with his time. I did 12 formal interviews with him and a lot of other conversations. And so this was a way of kind of trying to revisit my own intellectual origins when it came to settling the Arab-Israeli conflict, and try to recount the story to learn how to and how not to make peace, and to teach it in effect to those who had not known Kissinger. But we can get into this later. I discovered something that I did not expect, precisely because I thought I knew it, but I found out that in fact I did not know what Kissinger was all about at all.
Which I really want to get into. In fact, I have some questions about exactly some of those issues. But before we start, I think it's important to kind of set the stage. You know, the Yom Kippur War started in 1973, and the shuttle diplomacy that that Kissinger did in that period. It's been almost 50 years now. I do remember it, but I think many in our audience may not know the history. Could you talk about just the background in terms of the geopolitics of the situation at that time? There was superpower conflict with the Soviet Union, the Arab states, the relationship with Israel. Could you just set the stage for us before we go into some of that history?
Yeah, and that's, I think, a good thing to do, Richard. I appreciate it, because you're right. A lot of the people in the audience probably not even born at that time. But it was so foundational to everything else that happened in terms of America's role in the Middle East. So to set the scene, it was the height of the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And while there were kind of spheres of influence, like Eastern Europe, Ukraine, for instance, was part of the Soviet Union, there were these gray areas where the superpowers were competing. And that was nowhere more the case than in the Middle East, where the United States and the Soviet Union had basically lined up behind their clients who were engaged in their own conflicts in the region. So you had the Arab-Israeli conflict exacerbated by the fact that the superpowers were coming in, and the United States was backing Israel, Soviet Union was backing Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. The United States was also backing the Shah of Iran in the Gulf, and so you had this conflict overlaid by superpower competition, which was fueling the local conflict, both sides providing arms and so on. The conflict itself, at that point, was a reflection of the fact that in 1967, 6 years earlier, Israel had won a war against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, the Six-Day War, which had led it to occupy all of the Sinai Peninsula between Israel and Egypt up to the Suez Canal, the Golan Heights in Syria, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem that had previously been controlled by Jordan. And so from that point on, Israel was in occupation of a large amount of Arab territory, had become a much larger state geographically as a result, and was, as a result of its victory in that war over the 3 Arab armies, had become the dominant player in the region, backed now by the United States, but in a situation in which the Arabs could not accept that their land would stay occupied by Israel. And so the conflict was really boiling under the surface about the question of the disposition of the territory that Israel had occupied. In 1969, Egypt launched a war of attrition to try to pressure Israel to withdraw back from the Suez Canal out of the Sinai. But that had been calmed down by the superpowers into a ceasefire in 1970, and as a result of that, there was this uneasy no war, no peace situation in which Kissinger, who had become Nixon's national security advisor, and when Nixon took power in 1968, and he had basically overseen the efforts by the two of them, Nixon and Kissinger, to forge a détente with the Soviet Union, to negotiate arms control agreements, to negotiate the end to the war in Vietnam, and of course, the opening to China. And all of that had been done in the 4 years up to 1972. In 1973, having been re-elected, Nixon appointed Kissinger as his Secretary of State. And for the next 4 years, Kissinger spent most of his time negotiating Arab-Israeli peace. After the outbreak of the 1973 war in October 73, only a couple of weeks after he became Secretary of State, Egypt and Syria launched surprise attacks, coordinated surprise attacks on Israel that generated this war that Kissinger then engaged in with his diplomacy to negotiate with the Soviet Union a ceasefire in that war, and that became the basis of his diplomacy that I write about, that led to the establishment of two things: an American-dominated Middle Eastern order and an American-led Arab-Israeli peace process. That's where it all began, and to this day, even though the United States has not covered itself in glory in recent years when it comes to peacemaking in the Middle East, nevertheless still dominates that process such as it is.
That's very helpful. That overview is really, I think, puts it all in perspective. So thank you. And it's that peace process that one of the things that surprised me, and I'm getting back to the issue that you had discussed, and some of the things that you found surprising, was, since we're talking peace process, that for Kissinger, peace wasn't the objective. For him, it was order and stability. And in fact, he tried to use the desire for peace as a tool, use it to manipulate others in the negotiations. And was that one of the things that surprised you, or could you talk a little more about that?
Well said. You put it very well. Thank you. Now, you see, as I said, I decided to go back to where it all began because I felt that I need to understand what had gone wrong, what had gone so badly wrong in the effort to make peace. The United States had made significant progress, first of all, under Kissinger, with two agreements between Israel and Egypt that he negotiated that essentially took Egypt out of the conflict and transformed the nature of conflict between Israel, and there was no longer any Arab state that could launch war on Israel at that point. And a third agreement with Syria, which not only provided cover for Egypt, but stabilized the situation on the Golan Heights, in effect to this day. But that led on to the Israel-Egypt peace treaty that Jimmy Carter negotiated 2 years later after Kissinger left office. And then fast forward to President Clinton, and I came in as his Middle East advisor. And during that first year, we had the Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinians. In the second year, the Israel-Jordan peace treaty. So significant progress had been made up until that point. But it all collapsed in 2000 with the outbreak of the Intifada after the failure of our negotiations at Camp David between Israel and the Palestinians. And that Intifada really destroyed all trust between the Israelis and the Palestinians. thousands of people were killed or maimed on both sides. And ever since then, despite the fact that 4 presidents have tried, including Donald Trump, of course, it was like Humpty Dumpty. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. And that's exactly where we are today. And that's where I left it in 2014 when I was Barack Obama's special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. So I went back to try to understand what went wrong and what we could learn from the master of the game in Kissinger's diplomacy. What I discovered was something different. I thought I was going to write about his peace process diplomacy. Well, it was certainly about a peace process, but his purpose was something quite different. His purpose was to establish an American-dominated order in the Middle East, which would sideline the Soviet Union in the midst of the Cold War and create a stable order in the region. And that was not clear because Kissinger doesn't write about it that way. He was a master of obfuscation. We can get into why. But as I was reading the documents and all of his exchanges with Arab leaders like Sadat and Hafez al-Assad of Syria, and the Israelis, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Moshe Dayan, all these characters, Kissinger would repeatedly say to them, when they said that they wanted to take the big step, they wanted to make peace, so I'm talking about both sides, he would say, no, that's not worth having. Peace is just, a piece of paper. It doesn't end conflict. And what's more important is stability and order. And this, for me, was a head scratcher. It actually led to him underreaching in terms of what two sides were ready to do. As Jimmy Carter demonstrated, I said 2 years later, peace was in the offing. An Israel-Egypt peace treaty was achievable, but Kissinger wasn't interested in trying for that. And the reason was an innate skepticism about two things. One was that you could actually end conflicts between states. His view was that you could ameliorate conflicts, but you never really end them, or that it would take a long time to end them. And therefore, his approach was incremental, step by step, gradual, never trying for too much, never overreaching. It was a fundamentally conservative approach to conflict resolution. Second thing that he was skeptical about was American leaders. He thought that because of the immense power that Providence had provided to American leaders, they would inevitably get caught up in this idea that they could change the world, that they could make peace, that they could promote democracy, that they could change the world in America's image to a free, democratic, and peaceful domain. And there was no greater attraction than the holy grail of peace in the Middle East, peace in the Holy Land. And of course, that had a religious dimension to it as well. So it was these two things, his innate skepticism about the idea of ending conflict and about the dangerous passion of American leaders to try anyway to do it, that he was basically trying to construct a process that was different. A peace process, it was called a peace process, but it was more about process than it was about peace. It was more about taking small steps to ameliorate the conflict, to build trust, so that the Arabs and Israelis would eventually, down the road, long after he'd left office, decide that on the Arab side, it was time to accept Israel and recognize it and make peace with it. And on the Israeli side, that it would have had the time in the meantime, to build its strength with American support, reduce its isolation, and at the point that the Arabs were finally ready to end their conflict, that's when the Israelis would be strong enough to make the ultimate concessions of territory that would lead to Arab territory, that is, that they'd occupied in Six-Day War, that would lead to eventually that long sought after end of conflict, end of claims kind of peace. And it is happening. It happened between Israel and Egypt much faster than he expected. We see it now in the Abraham Accords, that the Arab states are finally coming to terms and accepting Israel. But it hasn't yet happened with the Palestinians. And that doesn't surprise Kissinger at all. He expects that it will take a long time.
No, thank you, sir. You mentioned American leaders and Kissinger's concern for American leaders. What you've described Kissinger doing is pretty amazing, and I certainly want to get into more of that. But obviously, he was Secretary of State. President Nixon and then later President Ford were the boss. And it seems that Kissinger had amazing freedom to maneuver, to do whatever he felt like. And I'm wondering, what was the dynamic between Kissinger and Nixon, and Kissinger and Ford later? And I'm sure the domestic situation in the U.S.
Right.
at that time had impact there. But what was the dynamic of that relationship that allowed Kissinger to do, or what did he have parameters that he had to stay within?
So this is one dimension I should have mentioned when I was doing this potted history of the time. Of course, it was a time of Watergate. By the time that Kissinger became Secretary of State, Nixon was already weighed down by his Watergate woes. And that meant that he was essentially out of it. And during the 1973 war, as Kissinger and Nixon's other national security team, Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, Al Haig, the Chief of Staff, they ordered a Defense Condition 3 nuclear alert to deter the Russians, the Soviets, from sending troops into the Sinai to protect the Egyptian army. That decision was made while Nixon was in bed, drunk, and they didn't even consult with him at the time. So that gives you the sense of it. That was right at the beginning of the period that I'm talking about. That was 73. After that, Nixon's woes became even greater, and eventually, of course, he resigned. During that period, he was deeply jealous of Kissinger's success flying around the Middle East, and he'd become a huge celebrity. The New York Times called him the president for foreign policy. This was deeply hurtful to Nixon. He was deeply jealous of this. But on the other hand, he made sure that the press traveled with Kissinger on his plane. These guys, Marvin Cowell, Bernard Cowell, Ted Koppel, all became giants later, but they were traveling at the back of the plane, reporting on everything that Kissinger did. And Nixon, despite the jealousy, wanted this because it was a way of diverting attention from Watergate. And it was a way of him trying to claim that, in fact, he was still doing important things in foreign policy. The Defense Condition 3 alert, DEFCON 3 nuclear alert, he subsequently the next day claimed that he'd ordered it, but in fact he hadn't at all. So that was Nixon. Essentially, he was out of it, and Kissinger had pretty much free rein. There were occasions, as I detail in the book, where he would intervene and issue instructions, and amazingly, Kissinger ignored them. Then when Ford took over, Ford was an ingenue. He didn't know foreign policy. He'd been Speaker in the House of Representatives. He was, a very decent man who didn't really know what was going on internationally. Kissinger had this giant reputation for all the things that he had done, however controversial. And so he basically tutored Ford. He would come in every morning and give him a tutorial. And so he was in effect in control of foreign policy throughout the period that Ford was president until the end of that time.
Wow. You know, I have so many more questions about the book, but I'm looking at the time, and I know we want to get later to the audience questions. So I'd like to turn, if I may, to some of the impact, perhaps, or lessons learned from the Kissinger experience to today. And for example, well, the impact. I was surprised. It was almost ironic to see that in your book you had mentioned that Putin used the excuse of basically trying to ensure that he was able to maintain Kissinger's state-led order in Syria. That was their justification to move into Syria to help Bashar al-Assad against these rebel groups that were trying to break this order. That were affiliated to Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda. And I'm wondering, you mentioned Kissinger's experience there trying to get the Russians out, or the Soviets at the time, out of the Middle East. We're facing right now a situation with Ukraine possibly invading, or the Russians possibly invading Ukraine. I'm wondering, what would you what kind of lessons would you offer to the Biden administration that Kissinger, from that Kissinger experience? What do you think he might have done in this situation for the Russians?
First of all, he never regarded Syria as critically important to the United States. In his realist approach, Egypt was critical. Syria was important because it would give Egypt cover to do something that was radical at the time, which is to make peace with Israel. And Syria was the kind of beating heart of pan-Arabism, of Arab nationalism. And so if he could get Assad also to engage with Israel and reach an agreement with Israel, which he did, it took him a huge effort. 30 days on the road, non-stop between Jerusalem and Damascus, 19 trips. And he did that in order to get Egypt out of the conflict and therefore transform the conflict. So he never really wanted to take Syria out of the Soviet pocket in the way that he was determined to do with Egypt. And Sadat worked with him on that. Sadat also wanted to get out from under the Soviet Union. He was surprised to discover that Assad actually wanted to get out too. And so he was prepared to kind of encourage him. But it never had the kind of driving logic of taking Egypt out of the conflict. So from his point of view, when Putin came back into Syria, he was not alarmed about that. It was not seen by him as a major blow to the United States. I don't know whether you remember at the time, Obama's attitude was also, if the Russians want Syria, they can have it. Good luck to them. But Kissinger didn't really strongly disagree with that. What he was concerned about, and we can see it now, is that by coming back into the Middle East, the Russians would have influence there that he had effectively excluded them from. Since the 1970s. For all of that time, the Russians were essentially sidelined. They went off to Afghanistan and failed there, and they were out of the Middle East. But moving back into Syria, we can see that they're now there in a big way. And this is interesting because I'll try to get to your question about Ukraine, but it's interesting just to note along the way that because Russia is back as a player in the Middle East, all of the local powers in the Middle East are extremely reluctant to side with the United States against Russia over Ukraine. And I'm including here Israel,
Hmm.
because Israel cannot afford to have a confrontation with Russia in Syria, where the Russians are allowing the Israelis to operate against Iran in Syria. And the Russians warned them off by running a joint patrol between the Syrian and Russian Air Force over the Golan Heights just a couple of weeks ago to make the point. But it's not just the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, everybody in the region now, the Egyptians, all of them, because the Russians are a player there, are not interested in creating problems. So whereas we would normally expect these countries that we've given so much support to would be on our side, especially a country like Israel, a country like Kuwait, that should be worried about bigger neighbors trying to invade these small countries. They're not standing up with us. So when it comes to Ukraine, you know, Kissinger's realist approach was one in which the superpowers naturally had spheres of influence. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, disintegrated, you know, there was no longer the superpower that could have a sphere of influence, and the idea of a sphere of influence kind of just faded away. Now Putin is trying to reestablish a sphere of influence. See it in Georgia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. And I think while Kissinger would oppose an invasion as a destabilizing act that would be highly problematic for the liberal international order, I don't think he would oppose the idea that the Ukraine should adjust its foreign policy in a way that took Russian interests into account. That's a diplomatic formula for what would turn out to be a kind of Finlandization of the Ukraine. I don't know whether the viewers are familiar with that concept, but Finland essentially is an independent state, but it acts very carefully not to cross certain red lines when it comes to Russian interests. And so that's essentially, I think, the way he would approach it. One other point about this, though. His view of the Soviet Union in the Middle East was basically that they had no business being there. And he was determined to push them out. When they challenged the United States, especially in the 1973 war, when they threatened to send troops, he believed in standing up to them with overwhelming threats of force. So I mentioned this Defense Condition 3 nuclear alert. That wasn't just putting all our forces on alert and our nuclear bombers on alert, but it was also sending three carrier battle groups into the Eastern Mediterranean, all designed to show the Soviet Union that if they dared to intervene in Egypt, they would be facing a huge, overwhelming response from the United States. That was the way that he liked to deal with the Soviet Union. And when he did, it worked quite well. Of course, you could look at what he did in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and say that the consequences were disastrous.
Oh, well, thank you. You know, and I'm looking at time. I know we need to get to audience questions here in a little bit, and I'm counting on one of them to ask someone to ask about the Iranian situation and the nuclear deal there. But I do have one last question I wanted to ask you, because you have told so many great stories about Kissinger, and you're a great storyteller, I have to say. But there are many revelations that you offer this, and you met with Kissinger. I wonder if Kissinger has read your book and what he had to say about it, if he told you.
Well, Kissinger is very sensitive to criticism. Doesn't like it at all. He has a thin skin. Not we all, but he has particularly thin skin. And he cooperated with this, and he was very generous with his time and gave me access to his papers. And so, you know, I felt some obligation to him to show him the book, not to just so that he wouldn't be surprised by it. So I showed him the two chapters that I thought were the best for him. And he called my wife, who had worked for him, and told her he never wanted to speak to me again. So it's kind of in the doghouse. Eventually, when the book came out and I sent him a copy, he heard from a friend of his who wrote him a long memo about how great the book was for him. And so he read it with a slightly less jaundiced view. And he called me up and he said, I owe you an apology. He said, I just don't like the way that you made me look manipulative. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but that's the whole point. That's what makes you the master of the game, is that diplomacy is really the art of sending leaders to places that they'd rather not go and making them feel like they want to go there. And he really was the master of that game. And that's part of the reason why I tell the story in such detail, because I think there is so much to learn about how diplomacy is done and what happens in those smoke-filled rooms when the negotiators get down to it. When you're actually able to watch, because he documented every word that he said and every word that they said in response, to actually see how he did it. And he came in the end to appreciate that I spent so much time doing that otherwise his artistry would not have got the same attention.
Interesting, really interesting. Well,
Could I just add one thing, Rich, because I don't want people to think that this is a hagiography. It's not. There are certainly a lot of things that I'm critical about with Kissinger and his diplomacy, while overall being very impressed with what he'd managed to achieve compared to what we'd managed to achieve. But he was very good at arguing not to overreach and making the case for not overreaching. But I show where he did the opposite and underreached, aimed too low. And that had dramatic negative consequences as well. I argue and document the way in which he could have headed off the 1973 war if he had put his mind to it. I show how he could have changed the whole trajectory of the Palestinian issue and the effort to resolve it, had he been willing to take some risks working with Israel and Jordan. And so, it's a composite picture. I hope I do justice to his artistry, but also to his failings.
Yeah, I'm sorry we didn't get to some of those. You make that quite clear in terms of in the book that it is not a painting just him as the master. In fact, you do mention some of those flaws. I'm sorry we didn't get to that, but and I have many questions, as I'm sure those do in our audience as well. So what I'd like to do right now is turn it over to Claire Krelitz to get to some of the questions from the audience. Claire, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. We have a lot of questions. Just a reminder to those in the audience, you can submit your questions on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And then also in that control panel, you'll find a chat bar where you can find the link to Ambassador Indyk's book, Master of the Game. And so with that, let's dive into our first audience question. So this person asks, in Kissinger's mind, what would make Israel strong enough to make the ultimate territorial concessions? What is his opinion on settlements overall?
So, in his mind, Israel would need to have the ability to deter Arabs and any part of the Arab world that sought to make war on it or destroy it. So he firmly believed, as a realist, in the need for a balance of power tilted in Israel's favor in order to achieve the effect that he wanted, which was for the Arabs eventually to tire of the conflict and come to terms with Israel. But he recognized, as a result of what happened in '73, that was not enough, that there had to be a peace process that gave the Arab powers a sense of fairness, a sense of justice. He did believe that the curve of the universe needed to bend towards justice. It's just on a very long timetable. But there needed to be a process of Israel handing over territory in tranches, in slices, in small steps that were digestible for Israel. But ultimately he believed that with Arab states taken out of the conflict, the United States backing Israel, Israel having an array of relations with other powers in the world, which it now has, that it would be in a position to make the ultimate move back to the 67 lines, more or less, with adjustments, which has been always the American position since the conflict began. And so he believes in that. He believes that the Palestinians should have a state, that on the way to statehood, the Palestinians should have attributes of sovereignty. A state in the making is what he calls it. And so, you know, at this point, I think he believed, or actually for some time, believed that Israel could make the ultimate sacrifice. But the irony is that, as I show in the book, he argued to the Israelis, because he didn't believe in peace himself, that they should exchange territory for time. And time for the Arabs to exhaust themselves, time for Israel to strengthen itself. But the irony was that the time that he bought Israel was time that Israel then used to settle the West Bank. And when he left office, there were 1,600 settlers. Today, there are something like 460,000 settlers. And so time was used to, in fact, for Israel to give up territory, to offer to give up territory everywhere else, and including 40% of the West Bank, but to hold on to the rest of it, to strengthen its grip on the rest of it. So that now it's almost inconceivable, it seems, that Israel would actually evacuate all those settlers. So ultimately, he believes that Israel has to make that final territorial concession. But I think he'd be the first as a realist to recognize that the politics don't allow it now.
Yeah, thank you. And this next question sort of connects right to that, which states that with the just sheer number of settlements that exist now, is there any future for Palestine or for Palestinians?
Yeah, look, I think that here I'm speaking for myself, not for Henry Kissinger, who's somebody who's been involved for many years in negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians to try to resolve it. That we know what the ultimate deal looks like. It's been negotiated in great detail, but we don't have a way to get there from here. There's too little trust, too much animosity on both sides. The Israelis don't believe that the Palestinians really want peace with Israel. The Palestinians don't believe that the Israelis would ever allow them to have an independent, contiguous Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. So there has to be a process of rebuilding trust. The leadership on the Israeli side is split within the government between those who oppose a Palestinian state and those who support it. On the Palestinian side, it's split between those who support a two-state solution and Hamas that supports a one-state solution, which Israel doesn't exist anymore. So you can't get there from here. What we need is a Kissingerian step-by-step process in which we, in effect, reinvent the Oslo process. The Oslo process, very interestingly, was designed by Rabin, but it was designed on Kissinger's terms, Kissinger's concept of a step-by-step approach. The Oslo agreements do not outline what the final status should be. There's no mention of a Palestinian state, no mention of Jerusalem, no mention of refugees in the Oslo agreements. What is agreed on is a step-by-step process in which Israel would withdraw from parts of the West Bank and Gaza in stages, with the ultimate solution left until later. That kind of incremental, step-by-step, time-buying process was exactly what Kissinger had in mind. And we need, I think, to go back to that. There needs to be a process. There needs to be a territorial component to it, which Kissinger always believed. But we need now to look at that 60% of the West Bank that is all in Israel's hands and figure out how Israel can give to the Palestinians control over part of that territory, step by step, until we can get to a point where we can encourage the two sides to sit down and negotiate the final agreements that will end their conflict and end the claims of both sides.
Thank you. And from here, what are your thoughts on the Abraham Accords, and did Kissinger provide any insight on them?
Yeah, well, Kissinger's insight on the Abraham Accords was precisely what I've been talking about. That eventually, he didn't believe this, that eventually the Arabs would come to terms with Israel after they had exhausted themselves. And it was ironic, I found very interesting, that Mohammed bin Zayed, the de facto ruler of the Emirates, when he announced that he was going to normalize relations with Israel and recognize it, he said he was tired of the conflict. And I think that really expresses the attitude of most Arab states at this point. They're tired of it. They've got bigger problems with Iran, with their own development, excuse me. And so, you know, they're ready to move on. That's precisely what Kissinger expected would happen. I do think that what's interesting about the Abraham Accords, and was unexpected, at least by me, was that Egypt and Jordan, who had already made peace with Israel, are now warming up their relations as a result of the Abraham Accords giving them cover and justification and incentive. And that was unexpected. Excuse me.
Great, thank you. This next question asks, how extensive are the financial ties between Russia and countries in the Middle East? Are those relationships purely based on military and/or energy policy?
Thank you. Excuse me. I've got a bit of a tickle in my throat. Too much talking. So Russia's financial investment is very limited in the Middle East. It's not a big economy, as you probably know. And its principal economic leverage is its oil exports, gas exports to Europe, but oil exports to the world. Russia and Saudi Arabia are the two biggest oil producers and exporters. And they have essentially reached an agreement in what's now called OPEC Plus to control the production of oil amongst all of the oil producers that are members of OPEC. They give them quotas in a way that would keep the price up. Now, the price is now at $90. I didn't check today, but it's going higher. If Putin decides to invade Ukraine, the expectation in the oil market is that the price will go to $120. That will be highly problematic for the world economy, highly problematic for inflation in the United States, highly problematic for Joe Biden's re-election prospects, and let alone the Democrats in the midterms. And so Saudi Arabia, which, you know, its leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has been in the American doghouse since his involvement in the murder of Adnan Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist. He essentially has his hand on the spigot. It's only Saudi Arabia that has the capacity to increase production in a way that would bring the price down, or at least tamper the price rises. And he doesn't want to break with Russia because they have this agreement in OPEC that would basically control the prices. So that's where the interesting conflict is going to arise. And President Biden is basically going to have to make a choice. If he wants that oil to flow, he's going to have to pick up the phone to Mohammed bin Salman. I'm not sure that this is such a great idea, but it is the reality of the situation that we now find ourselves in if Putin actually does order the invasion of the Ukraine.
Thank you. The next question asks, can you comment on the upcoming meeting between Turkish President Erdogan and Israeli President Herzog, given the animosity Erdogan holds towards Israel? What is the aim of their meeting, and what do you think will come out of it?
So, first of all, it's important to understand that we're in an era in the Middle East that we can refer to as the return of history, the return of geopolitics, the return of the great game. And that's essentially happening because the American-dominated order that Henry Kissinger built is coming apart, partly as a result of our own missteps and overreaching in Iraq, breakdown of the peace process that was so critical to the building up of American dominance in the Middle East, and the decision first made by Obama, reinforced by Trump, and now by Biden, to focus elsewhere, to de-emphasize the Middle East as a priority, and instead focus on, in particular, on the rise of China. Now, instead of focusing on the rise of China, we've got to focus on the assertiveness of Vladimir Putin in Europe. But it nevertheless reinforces this sense that the United States is turning its back on the Middle East. That's not actually the reality. We still maintain strong presence there, but that certainly is the perception in the region. As a result, the states in the region are looking to others. And one of the outside powers that they're looking to is Turkey. So Turkey sees that it has an opportunity in the region. Turkey, however, has a liability. Erdogan is the inheritor of the Ottoman legacy. And the Arabs in particular remember the Ottoman Empire, and they don't remember it fondly. So he's trying to enter the Middle East, and in particular the Arab world, in a situation where there's some resistance to that idea. And so he promotes the Palestinian cause, which is a pan-Arab cause, as a way of trying to popularize Turkey and himself amongst the Arab people, if not amongst the regimes. And it's not working very well. But as a result of his use of that device, championing the Palestinians, it came at the expense of Turkey's relations with Israel. And Turkey's relations with Israel go back to essentially the founding of the state. Israel and Turkey had the first strategic agreement of any relationship that Israel had. And that Turkish-Israeli relationship really thrived and turned into a dramatic business relationship and tourist relationship during Erdogan's rule. So prior to him deciding to try to take advantage of America's retreat from the region, he had very good relations with Israel. He is now trying to rebuild it because the other way didn't work. And just as the Arabs are getting tired of the Palestinians, he's realizing that pushing the Palestinian cause isn't really going to help him very much. So he's trying a rapprochement with Israel, just as the Arab states are also engaging in this normalization process with Israel. The competition, interestingly, as a result of the Abraham Accords, has changed. And so I think that the meeting between Bougie Herzog, the new president of Israel, and President Erdogan is bound to succeed because the Turks want it to, and the Israelis see some advantage in it. But the Israelis will be careful and skeptical because they don't really trust him not to turn on them again as he did once before.
Thank you. And so we're getting close to the end of the hour, and we have a few people asking about Colonel Downie's question on the Iranian situation and the nuclear deal. So I don't know if you want to join us again and ask your formal question, but we do have interest in that. So I will have that be our final question from you in the audience. Thank you so much, Ambassador Indyk. It was a pleasure to join you, and we hope to have you back soon at the Council.
Thank you, Claire. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Claire. And on behalf of all those in the audience that are interested in that question, you know, it's fascinating to me, Ambassador Indyk, that Netanyahu, during his time in office, during the Trump presidency, pressured Trump to get out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian nuclear deal that President Obama had coordinated and established. And so with that pressure, the US did pull out of the nuclear arrangement. Now, obviously, President Biden is trying to make some sort of an arrangement that the Iranians don't seem to be willing to budge very much. But what we're hearing now, at least from high-level voices in Israel, is that this was a mistake, that it was not such a good idea, that the US could have left or should have left the nuclear agreement in terms of security for Israel. So I'm wondering what your thoughts on there, and what you think that based on Kissinger's experience, what would he do in a situation like this?
Right. So Kissinger views Iran through this realist lens as a regional power with a great civilization, a real state. And he kind of respects the Iranians for that. But he says repeatedly that they have to decide whether they're a revolution or a state, whether they're a cause or a country. When they decide that they're a state and a country, then the United States can deal with it in a way that could become quite useful for the order that he still seeks in the Middle East. But until that point, until they make that decision, as they remain a revolutionary power, his view is that they have to be contained and deterred. He didn't like the agreement any more than the Israelis did, but he certainly doesn't like the way that Iran is advancing towards a nuclear threshold, having pulled out of the agreement and loosed itself of all the constraints of the agreement. So I think he broadly supports going back to the agreement as a way of stopping them from crossing over the nuclear threshold and having enough weapons-grade uranium to actually make a bomb. If they go back to the agreement, all the stuff that they've enriched since they left the agreement would be shipped out of the country. So we'd be kind of resetting the clock. But there's not a lot of time left on the agreement. And at the end of the agreement, the reason the Israelis were critical of it was that the Iranians can go back to doing what they're doing now. And so it's obviously not going to be enough. It's just a first step to try to pause their program and give a little bit of time, during which, in Kissinger's view, they have to be contained and they have to be deterred, just like he did with the Soviet Union. And to do that, because the United States is focused elsewhere, we need to support a coalition of Arab and Israeli states to counter and deter the Iranians. So supporting, the United States supporting a Sunni-Israeli alliance partnership lubricated by the Abraham Accords and by American backing is what he believes is essential to deal with the threat, the revolutionary challenge of Iran.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, good. Well, Ambassador Indyk, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Really interesting. Once again, I encourage our audience to take a look at your book. It's just a fascinating. But let me offer you the last word before I close it out and hand it over to Kim.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. Thank you, first of all, for for doing this, Richard, and to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. I hope people will read the book because it's a deep history of what it's like to be engaged in negotiating not only peace, but negotiating a stable order in a very complicated part of the world. And I believe, and the reason I wrote the book is there's no better teacher of how that works and what to do than Henry Kissinger. And he got up to amazing things along the way. So it's a fun read too. Even talking to Liza Minnelli in the middle of the 1973 war. So thank you, and I hope you'll all enjoy the book.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Indyk, and it's been a real pleasure and an honor talking with you today. And we wish you the best there in a snowy Connecticut. There, we're in California right now. We're appreciating the warmth. So thank you again for just a fascinating discussion. And thank you to all of those in the audience today for your great questions and for a very lively discussion. Kim, would you close it out for us? Thank you.
I want to underscore, thank you, Ambassador, for such an informative, fascinating, and inside baseball conversation. I learned so much, so thank you. I just ordered your book. I can't wait to dive into it. And Richard, you've moderated so many of our programs. We're so appreciative of your time and your expertise. We do need to have you both back. This is such a timely subject. I want to get you back after I've read the book thoroughly. Thank you both.
Good one. It's a good one.
Let's hope we can do it in person. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. For our viewers, we have some terrific upcoming programs. Remember, February 1st, Dan Schnur and the Dan Schnur Political Report at 5 p.m. Then on February 3rd, we have the U.S. response to the Russo-Ukrainian crisis. This will be some experts from the Department of State and the RAND Corporation, so it's a great follow-up to today's discussion. On February 8th, we have the New World of Work with Kian Gohar, who's the former director of the X Prize Foundation, and Renee Frazier, who's CEO of Frazier Communications. It's a whole new world, as many of you business leaders are figuring out post-COVID re-entry. We have, as I've mentioned, a new LA mayoral candidate series starting February 15th. This is in person. The first candidate, Joe Luscano, will be appearing on the 15th with moderator Dan Schnur. This is a unique opportunity to hear how each of the top candidates will be tackling the issues facing the second largest city in America. Dan will be interviewing the top candidates once a month, beginning February 15th, continuing into the June primaries. So check out our website at lawacth.org, register today, and please stay safe, and we'll see you on February 1st with Dan Schnur. Thanks, everyone.